Up next is Peter Werner with the Forest Service. Peter is a mining engineer by training and currently serves as the on-scene coordinator for the Riley Pass Uranium Mine Circle Project for the Forest Service. In addition to his duties as on-scene coordinator, Peter assists other national forests with permitting and oversight of new mining operations. Peter is a proponent of employing a holistic approach to mine reclamation as a means to accelerate post-mine ecosystem recovery. Today's presentation is on long-term care and maintenance at reclaimed mine sites. Please welcome Peter.
Thanks, Sam. Can you give me like a 10-minute heads up and then 10 minutes?
Yes,
for
will do.
Thanks.
Yeah. I was going to give you like 25, so we have 5 minutes for questions. Sure. Great.
Thank you. Well, this is a real treat. I haven't been to the Mine Design and Closure Conference for some years now. Nonetheless, I do recognize a number of familiar faces in the crowd. I just wonder, though, if this is going to be a friendly group or not. And the reason I say that is I'm going to be talking about basically long-term bonding. And usually when people talk about long-term bonding, there is a definite reaction, and it animates people on the subject. So I plan to cover it by talking about the how, what, and why of long-term care and maintenance. And I'm going to touch on 3 broad themes. One, how should we be thinking about long-term care and maintenance? And I contend we should be thinking about it geologically. What should be included? It's not just about water treatment. And why is it important? Because the alternative is really, really expensive. The Government Accounting Office came out with its report on expenditures on abandoned mine cleanup on federal lands from 2008 to 2017. $3 billion was spent on remediating physical and environmental hazards. During that 10-year period, about $300 million per year. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's all Congress appropriated for the land management agencies to clean up these sites. It's going to cost billions and billions more to address all of these legacy sites. Now, I can see that most of these sites predate our modern mining regulations. Nonetheless, they are expensive undertakings, and let's see what our current regulations, how they work on addressing these issues. What I have here are excerpts from the Forest Service, BLM, and State of Montana hard rock mining regulations. It's from their reclamation section, and I've highlighted that text, which I think is particularly of interest. The first one's from the Forest Service. They're talking about what the goals of reclamation are, and it's to prevent or control on-site and off-site damage. Second one's from the BLM. Prevent or control on-site and off-site damage. Not terribly imaginative, must have been written by the same person. And the third one is from State of Montana MMRA regs, and they're talking about the goal of reclamation is to generate a reclaimed site with comparable utility and stability. Question is, when does this happen? When or how long will it take? How long is it going to take to prevent or control on-site or off-site damage? Can anybody tell me how long that's going to take? When it occurs? Let's see how the mining companies deal with this issue. I've got 2 excerpts from plans of operation, one from Siboney Stillwater, the other one from Resolution Copper. The first one is from Stillwater's East Boulder operation. It's from the reclamation plan talking about when bond release can occur for their tailings impoundment. And it says, when it reaches a condition that in the opinion of the agencies is considered to be physically, chemically, ecologically, and socially stable. Now, I don't know what the last one is. I'll have to ask the folks from Stillwater what socially stable means. But as far as the other ones, how will the regulator know when things are physically, chemically, ecologically stable? Is it the old, I'll know it when I see it approach? Similarly, the bottom one's from Resolution Copper's operation in Arizona, and it's talking again about reclamation goals for the tailings impoundment, and they want to develop a long-term landform that maintains stability and integrity. Again, how long is that going to take to reach that condition? And what you'll see missing from both the regulations as well as the plans of operation is the time component. And therein lies the regulator's dilemma. How do you bond for something where you don't know the time frame over which you're bonding? Now, this is not just a regulatory issue. The industry has a role in this as well. Many mining companies have bought into the ESG movement, and the principles that's here work nicely with the ESG principles of, ensuring that you're doing the socially responsible thing, that you're doing the environmentally responsible thing, and that you're operating your mind with including the community and in a responsible fashion. So they have a vested interest in making sure that their operation is stable once it's in closure. So how do we arrive at changing how we look at long-term closure? And I would say we need just a change in thinking. Dare I say a paradigm shift? I know if Pat Plantenberg were here, and many of you know Pat, he would be hammering his shoe on the seat in front of him, yelling about the perils of shifting paradigms. But that is what I think needs to happen in the industry. First, there's a new landform on the landscape. It's not a terribly profound statement, but what do we know about landforms? We know that Mother Nature wants to take tall and pointy landforms and make them low and flat. A group in Australia is doing some really interesting work on landform evolution modeling. And one of the studies I saw that came out of their group, they looked at a tailings impoundment that was beautifully designed, very geometric in shape, very linear slopes, very angular corners, and they modeled it over hundreds, 1,000 years and examined how it changed its shape at 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years. And by the time it got out to 1,000 years, this thing was it had melted into the ground. It was just a stain on the landscape after 1,000 years. It had been incised, eroded, carried away by the elements. So, landforms evolve, waste rock dumps evolve, tailings impoundments evolve. We need to start making a distinction between operating life and functional life. Oftentimes we get hung up on focusing on the operating time frame. And the way I'm defining that is that it covers a finite period of use, like during operations, while you're putting tailings in the impoundment, while you're adding waste rock to the dump. But then we also need to consider the functional life. And that's a time frame where these facilities may need to meet or exceed performance requirements, maybe even forever. I mean, consider that most mines will be around for 30, 40 years. But their facilities will be on the landscape far, far longer than those 40 years. There's a great disconnect between the effort we put into designing and examining how these things operate when the mine is in production versus what happens to them after they're closed. I mean, those people of you who are in permitting, whether on the industry side or the regulatory side, you know that a plan of operations may have pages and pages and appendices of how, let's say, a tailings impoundment is going to be operated and the complexities of that. But when it comes to the closure plan, you're lucky if you get 2 or 3 paragraphs describing what this thing is going to, how it's going to behave and how it's going to be managed. We need to acknowledge that we live in a changing environment. And we need to stop thinking about mine closure in engineering time, start thinking about it in geologic time. And we need to appreciate the geomorphological processes and the landscape evolution that goes on. I'm going to add a 4th item, something called irrational optimism. It's something we all suffer from. This has been studied by the behavioral scientists, and it's really nothing more than we as humans, while we're able to abstractly acknowledge danger and risk, we think it's not going to happen to us. Things like denial, complacency, groupthink, deferring to the loudest voice in the room, all factor into this irrational optimism behavior. We just don't think that something bad can happen at our mine site. I put this slide up just to kind of underscore this whole concept of engineering time versus geologic time. On the left, you have features that you could find at almost any mine site. Some of them highly engineered. Many of them have, a design life associated with them. On the right, natural processes that will be relentless in their assault on the list of things on the left. And all these processes on the right, they have no expiration date. Let's look at some examples. I'll try to illustrate what I've been talking about. 2 very different landscapes. What can be said about the landscape on the left? Looks like mountainous terrain, some vegetation. It looks like snow on some of the higher peaks, probably a northern latitude type location. Some principal drainages, large watersheds. Stream hydrograph for those drainages, probably kind of bell curve shaped with long tails on either side. Northern climate, soil depths are probably not very deep, probably organic rich, probably can't hold a lot of water, prone to instability. A lot of steep slopes, it looks like. Let's contrast that to the landscape on the right. What do you notice? Stream density is much greater. Doesn't look like there's any vegetation at all. Probably a desert climate. What do we know about the desert? Intense storm events, usually form of precipitation, high-intensity runoff, high-velocity events, poor soil development, what soil there is, very granular, the high velocities from the storm events, mobilize materials in suspension and through scour. Hydrograph probably is very steep ascending limb and an equally steep descending limb, and very narrow. Quick, high-intensity storms. So, depending where you are, you've got two very different geomorphological processes at work shaping the landscape. Back to our northern latitude location. It's photographs from about 30 years ago. You can see we're hard up against the mountains. Today, there's a mine there, right at the mouth where the East Boulder River comes out. I want to acknowledge Stillwater for agreeing to let me use some photographs and images from their permitting documents. I certainly appreciate it. Again, this is the East Boulder site. You can see the existing tailings impoundment. What do you notice? Oh, looks like we've got some remnant slope instability going on. Similarly here, similarly there. Where is it? It's right above where the proposed tailings impoundment expansion is going to go, what Jim talked about earlier. Another view of the East Boulder mine of the tailings impoundment with the East Boulder River in the foreground. You can see the river meanders that have been created over time and how close they come to the impoundment. Why is this important? At full build-out, the East Boulder impoundment, existing impoundment, will contain 100,000 times the annual sediment load to the East Boulder River. It's a huge source of potential sediment. Let's go down to the desert, where Resolution is proposing to put its tailings impoundment. Right there in the bottom of the drainage, blocking all of those side drainages. This thing at full build-out is going to be about 4,000 acres. Distances across it are measured in miles. It's going to contain 1.4 billion tons of tailings. The design is to route all of the run-on from the surrounding areas over the top of this thing and out a notch over by the left abutment. What makes this especially problematic is they are nesting 220 million tons of highly concentrated pyrite tailings in the center of this thing. So this needs to be very robust and immune from any kind of degradation. Okay. How do we go about getting our arms around long-term care and maintenance needs and identifying some of these risks? Well, through simple risk assessment, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, and some of the benefits for identifying what could go wrong, describing things, assigning timeframes, developing mitigations. It can be a very transparent process, and it's open for stakeholder participation. This is just a simple risk register. The Forest Service did a risk assessment on one of the mines on Forest Service ground several years ago. Looked strictly at the post-closure time frame. What was interesting is that we determined it was not the extreme event that was the risk driver. Rather, it was the chronic year over year annual degradation of systems that posed the greatest threat to the long-term stability of the site. It's kind of like that proverb that for want of a nail, the shoe was lost, for want of the shoe, the horse was lost, for want of the horse, the rider was lost, and so on and so forth, until the kingdom is lost. If you don't take care of some of the minor issues as they come up, they can escalate and turn into much larger, impactful problems. Here's just the heat map. You can see the original risk assessment had a fair number of items up here in the high-risk zone with simple annual mitigations, cleaning out a diversion ditch, filling in a rill and gully. We were able to move the risk level down into the lower left into a more low-risk environment. Okay. Why should this be an issue? I started out talking about the expenditures on our current abandoned mines. There is a very simple solution. You utilize the time value of money to address this. You can put money aside in an interest-bearing fund right up front to take care of this. I did a quick calculation based on $250,000 in annual expenditures. I used an extremely low discount rate. If you run the calculation out, $250,000 per year in annual care and maintenance, undiscounted approach, 1.25 times 10 to the 30th dollars. Any number followed by 30 zeros is a really big number. In fact, there's a name for it. It's called a nonillion. However, if you do it with a present value approach, it will only cost you $51 million. That seems like a pretty good deal. $51 million is not an insurmountable cost. Obviously, there are shortcomings with this. Initial assumptions are very important. The account requires active management to meet your financial goals. And I put this last item in there, what I call the 100-year fallacy. You may hear that 100 years is the same as perpetuity, so you only need to run your DCF out for 100 years. That is flat out wrong. It all depends on the discount rate you're using and some of your annual costs. So, momentum is building. The feds are starting to recognize that this is a real problem, that long-term care and maintenance, is something they should be dealing with in their regulations. Other NGOs and government organizations also have recognized the need and are putting in place requirements to have long-term bonding as part of any permit approval. So, to recap, why is long-term care and maintenance important? Because there's a permanent new landform on the landscape that will evolve over time. Who is going to take care of it? You can use risk assessment tools to identify the long-term liabilities. Use the time value of money to fund what otherwise is a really, really expensive undertaking, and above all else, resist irrational optimism. That wraps it up.